Why does he have this obsession with tariffs as a policy tool? Obviously, he's playing to, a political audience at home. But the problem with China's, trillion-dollar trade surplus last year is that exports are booming. They're growing by about 10 or 12%, 3 times as fast as world trade. How bad do things have to get before Xi Jinping's personal position is at risk? China is tooling up for a trade war. Trump's tariffs will hit China's crucial export market, forcing the country to look for other solutions to ease the pain. George Magnus from Oxford University's China Center joins me now. Welcome, George. We saw Xi meeting the tech tycoons, including Yang Fang, who is the hero of the hour since he introduced his open-source AI platform, DeepSeek. What do you think the plan is here? It's kind of interesting, actually, to look at the symposium that was held. This is the third time that Xi Jinping has held such a symposium with entrepreneurs and private businesses. The first one was in 2018, as Donald Trump had started his first trade war. The second one was in 2020, when China was in full flow of clamping down on Jack Ma and Alibaba and the whole kind of suppression of the tech sector and the digital sector in China. And so this is the third time and follows a number of initiatives that the government's taken to be softer and have a much kind of gentler rhetoric with private firms and entrepreneurs. And Xi Jinping obviously wants to have them on board in the face of what is, a difficult time for the Chinese economy anyway, but also exacerbated, as you say, by the prospect of trade disruption, export controls, and who knows what's coming down the track. But certainly the 10% down payment on tariffs imposed by the United States on Chinese products, incremental tariff, probably is just the beginning of more to come. It must be strange to be a tycoon of any description in China these days. We had Jack Ma disappear. The tall poppy syndrome, that if you do too well, you're going to get your head cut off. Do you think the private sector is still wary? Well, if you read the comments that were made by some of China's entrepreneurial titans after the symposium, obviously they're all, very happy and on board and, happy to support the government and, go forth and multiply in terms of the strategic industries and increase competitiveness, etc., etc. I suspect, though, that privately things are not quite as rosy as it's painted out to be. It is a moot point, I think it's fair to say, whether the disaffection that I think is paramount in the private sector in China is due only to the repressive attitude of the government. And remember that Xi Jinping said in his formal speech to them that government policies are not going to change and that the government's overall economic strategy is what it is, you have to accept it, take it or leave it. Mostly take it. But I think it's a moot point whether it's that or whether actually it's the state of demand in the Chinese economy. Let me put it this way, if Chinese companies were making money hand over fist, and I don't just mean state enterprises, which tend not to make that much money, but private firms in particular, if they were making money hand over fist and they were looking at buoyant consumer demand and healthy growth the way that they probably were looking at business maybe 10 or 20 years ago, would they be in need of this kind of pep talk? I don't think so. So it's a combination, I think, both of the fact that the economy is not in great shape and the government is not really doing anything about it, or not much, and not much that's effective. But also, obviously, the political atmosphere is something which is not going to change. The government can't really change that. Now we're seeing and hearing a lot less talk these days about the real estate crisis and local government debt. Why do you think that is? I mean, have these issues been resolved, or are they better than they were? Or is this just the way the narrative is being imposed now? Yeah, I think it's not. They've definitely not been resolved, but there may be a bit of a hiatus going on now. I mean, remember that last year, for an economy that was allegedly growing by about 5% in 2024, it's probably going to have a target about the same level this year. For that sort of economy, the government was boosting liquidity all during the year. It cut interest rates a few times. It lowered banks' reserve requirements at least twice. There were huge efforts made to stabilize the housing sector and increase the attractiveness of sales for hard-pressed homeowners or would-be homeowners. What else did we have? You know, we had 10 trillion yuan, so that's like over $1.25 trillion of debt swaps announced by the central government for local governments to alleviate the debt pressures and the financing pressures thereunder. So, you know, the government really pushed out the barrel, pushed out the boat, last year to try to sort of rescue what was, I think, an economy that was probably not growing anywhere close to 5%. So, yeah, I think there's, you know, the spirit with which private entrepreneurs are coming into 2025 may look okay, but actually the real estate market sales are picking up a little bit in Tier 1 cities. Prices have sort of just put their head above the parapet, as it were. I think we've got like 0.1% increase in home prices year over year in Tier 1 cities. 5 Tier 1 cities. So there's a bit of a lull, I would say, going on. And the economy should actually do a little bit better in 2025 than what was a much worse performance than seen in 2024. But these problems have not really been resolved and they're not going away quickly. So looking at this year, we're seeing the Chinese consumer. There's basically two problems in many ways. The Chinese consumers are not spending money, and then you have these overcapacity problems overseas. Looking at the domestic economy, what Chinese consumers are not spending the money, what do you think it would take to get them to start flashing the cash again? Well, I think the answer to that question is pretty simple, really. In order to bolster household consumption, which I'm sure a lot of people know this, but just by way of reminder, private consumption in China, if you exclude social security benefits and the role of the government in terms of the consumer sector, private consumption is probably no more than about 39 or 40% of GDP. Which, in terms of most of China's peer group, and not to mention developed economies, is much closer to 60 to 70%. So it's very low. To basically get consumers to fork out more, they have to have a much greater capacity to be able to spend money, which means income. So if you want to boost household consumption in China, you have to boost income growth. If you want to boost income growth, it's a distribution problem. You have to take it away from local governments and the state sector and state enterprises and redistribute to private firms and private households. That's politically very awkward for the government to do because it entails a redistribution not just of economic capacity but a redistribution of political power. As you can imagine, the Chinese Communist Party is not really very keen on doing that. And given that we have these struggles in the domestic economy, at the same time you've got the threat of tariffs, you've got massive overcapacity. I mean, a lot of these Chinese companies, for example, have been selling goods overseas at massive discounts ahead of possible tariffs, which means that they could be very exposed. It's quite a balancing act at this stage really for the Chinese government to manage these two challenges. Is that right? It is. I mean, as things stand, I don't think that the additional 10% tariffs on Chinese products are going to, I don't think they're going to be that crippling or actually that influential in terms of the Chinese economy this year, because there are ways in which, obviously, the Chinese economy and the Chinese government can bypass the effect. So they could allow the exchange rate to depreciate, for example, much as they did in 2017 and 2018, and that would help to defray the impact on China to some degree. Also, as we saw during the years following the initial tariffs from the Trump administration in 2017 to 18, Chinese companies and foreign companies in China can actually relocate their production or their trade essentially to third countries, for example, like Vietnam or India or Thailand or Mexico, although that's not kind of safe anymore either. But to other countries in order to bypass the impact of the tariff on the mainland. So 10%, I think, is probably dealable with, if you pardon the expression. But if Trump came back, for example, and imposed 25% tariffs, he's talking about so-called reciprocal tariffs, and, there's a lot that China and particularly other emerging and developing countries, do have recourse to. All sorts of things that the Americans could invoke, not just in terms of direct tariffs but also non-tariff measures or so-called behind-the-border measures, which are part of kind of industrial policy, which China does on a very, very massive scale. So these tariffs could actually take a much bigger toll on China, on everybody really, including the United States. But it would be, if they were like 25% or 35% tariffs on top of what's already been imposed, then I think that we would probably be talking about a much more deleterious effect on the Chinese economy.